Sometimes life moves too fast. You wake up with a list in your head, things to do, people to call, tasks to finish. You move from one thing to another, chasing time as if you could ever catch it. And when the day finally ends, it feels like you've been running, but never really arrived anywhere. That was how my week had been. Loud, restless, full of unfinished thoughts. Every message felt urgent. Every moment too short. And so when the rain started that evening, I didn't rush home. I simply walked. The lane was soft. Not the kind that hurts your skin, but the kind that speaks in whispers. It filled the air with that quiet silver scent only rain can bring. Streetlights glowed like blurred halos through the mist. People hurried past under umbrellas, their reflections stretching and bending across the wet pavement. For the first time in a long while, I slowed down. I passed familiar shops, a bakery closing for the night, a flower stop pulling down its shutters, a bookstore with a dim light still on its side. Everything looked softer under the rain, like the city had taken a deep breath. And then, just as I turned the corner, I saw it. A small wooden sign hung above a narrow doorway. The paint was chipped, the words slightly faded, but still clear enough to read. Open, coffee and peace. I stopped. Something about those words made me smile. Coffee and peace. It sounded almost like a promise. Through the fogged window, I saw a warm glow and the faint outline of chairs, a counter, and what looked like a single old lamp shining over a wooden table. It didn't look like much, yet somehow it felt alive, like a heartbeat, steady and patient. I hesitated for a second, unsure if I should walk in. Maybe it was just another cafe, maybe nothing special. But then again, maybe it was something I didn't know I needed. The rain thickened, and a gust of wind brushed against my coat. I took one last look down the empty street, then reached for the handle. The door creaked slightly as it opened. A small bell rang overhead, a single clear note that cut through the rain like a whisper of welcome. Warm air greeted me, carrying the scent of roasted coffee beans and cinnamon. And for the first time that day, maybe that week, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Welcome, I thought, to the cafe at the end of the street.
The cafe was smaller than I expected, but it felt alive in a quiet way. The walls were lined with books and old photographs, each one tinted by the soft amber glow of table lamps. A slow jazz melody drifted through a speaker in the corner, blending with the faint hiss of milk steaming somewhere behind the counter. I stood for a moment, just taking it in. The air was warm, thick with the smell of roasted beans and rain-soaked clothes. It was the kind of place where time didn't seem to matter, as if every second stretched a little longer, just so you could rest inside it. Behind the counter stood an old man, He must have been in his 70s, with silver hair that curled gently over his ears. His face was lined, but not tired. When he looked up, his eyes smiled before his lips did. "Welcome, traveler," he said softly, wiping his hands on a dark brown apron. "I think you need a quiet place." I laughed under my breath, unsure what to say. He was right. I did. "How did you know?" I asked. He chuckled lightly. "Everyone who walks in here wears the same look. Tired eyes, heavy heart. The city takes more than it gives, doesn't it?" I nodded. He turned around and reached for a small porcelain cup. "Sit anywhere you like. I'll bring you something special." I found a seat by the window, the one where raindrops drew tiny rivers across the glass. From there, I could still hear the hum of the world outside, but it sounded far away, softened by the rhythm of falling rain. The old man returned a minute later with a steaming cup of coffee. He placed it in front of me carefully, as if it were something sacred. "How special," he said. "No sugar, just truth." I smiled. "Truth sounds bitter," I said. He leaned on the counter, the corners of his eyes creasing with a knowing smile. "At first, yes," he said, "but it wakes you up better than caffeine." I wrapped my hands around the cup. The heat sank into my palms, gentle but steady. The first sip was bold, a little sharp, yet strangely comforting. It didn't taste like any coffee I'd ever had before. It tasted honest. I took another sip, slower this time. The bitterness gave way to warmth, and for a reason I couldn't explain, I felt lighter. The barista didn't ask me anything else. He simply nodded, as if he already knew what I needed. Then he turned back to the counter, humming softly to himself. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, I began to breathe again. The coffee was still warm in my hands when I started to look around the room. There were only a few people there, yet the cafe felt full. Not of noise, but of quiet lives, brushing softly against each other. In the far corner, near a stack of old books, a young woman sat sketching in a small brown notebook. Her pencil moved quickly, then paused, then moved again, like her thoughts were trying to remember what beauty used to feel like. Across from her, an elderly woman read a book. Her glasses rested at the tip of her nose, and every few minutes she'd lift her head and smile at something on the page, as if she was reading a memory, not just a story. And by the window, closest to the rain, sat a man in a dark coat, staring at the street outside. He didn't move much, didn't sip his drink. He just watched the world through the rain. The barista noticed my gaze. Without looking up from the counter, he said, "Everyone who comes here carries something. A story, a wound, a hope." "What about them?" I asked quietly. He nodded toward the sketching girl. "She draws because she forgot what her dreams look like." Then he glanced at the old woman. "She reads because stories remind her that it's never too late to start again." Finally, he looked toward the man at the window.
And him, he's waiting for someone who never came. The words hung in the air like slow-falling dust. I didn't know what to say. The cafe felt even quieter now, as if every breath in the room carried a different kind of sadness. But it wasn't a heavy sadness. It was gentle. The kind that accepts life for what it is, with all its unfinished pages and unsent letters. For the first time in weeks, I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't think about the time or the next thing I had to do. I just sat there, listening to the rain and the soft clinking of cups. The sketching girl looked up at me suddenly and smiled. She said, "You're new here. Don't worry. Everyone finds something they didn't know they were missing." Her voice was soft, her smile brief, but something about it lingered. Like sunlight that stays behind, even after the clouds return. Time moved differently inside the cafe. There was no clock, yet I could feel the hours unfolding like soft fabric, unhurried, peaceful, endless. The sound of rain against the window blended with the low hum of jazz and the quiet sigh of pages turning. Every now and then, someone came in, whispered an order, and left a few minutes later, calmer than they had arrived. The old barista walked over and placed something on my table. It wasn't another cup of coffee. It was a small, worn notebook. Its corners were bent and the cover was a little faded, like it had been touched by hundreds of hands. He smiled and said, "Write something, a thought, a memory, anything. People leave little pieces of themselves here." I opened the book slowly. The pages were full, covered in different handwritings, in different languages, some letters neat and small, others wide and flowing. Each page felt alive, as if it still remembered the person who wrote it. I read the first message I saw. "I came here to escape the noise, but I found myself instead." The next one said, "I met a stranger who reminded me of who I used to be." And another, written in delicate blue ink, "I realized I don't need to be fixed. I just need to be quiet for a while." I ran my fingers along the pages. It felt like touching a heartbeat. Hundreds of them, from people I'd never meet. Each note was a confession, a whisper, a gentle truth. No names, no dates, no explanations, just honesty. I thought about what I could write. What could I possibly add to a book that already seemed full of truth? I hesitated for a long moment, listening to the steady rain and the soft tap of cups being set down on saucers. Finally, I picked up the pen and wrote. Maybe slowing down isn't losing time. Maybe it's finding it again. When I looked up, the barista was watching me from behind the counter. He nodded, a quiet smile on his face. "You're starting to taste the truth," he said gently. I smiled back, unsure what to say. somehow it didn't feel like small talk. It felt like understanding, the kind you don't need words for. He walked away, humming softly, while I stared at my handwriting, still wet on the page. The ink glistened under the dim light for a moment, then dried, as if sealing a promise I didn't know I had made. Outside, the rain had slowed, but I didn't feel ready to leave. For the first time in years, I didn't want the moment to end.
That night, when I finally left the cafe, the rain had thinned into a soft drizzle. The air outside felt cleaner, lighter, as if the whole city had been washed and reset. I didn't open my umbrella. Instead, I walked slowly, letting the cool drops find my skin. The streets were almost empty. The sound of my footsteps echoed softly between the quiet buildings. Neon light shimmered in puddles, breaking into tiny, trembling pieces of color. It felt like I was walking through a dream that belonged only to me. When I reached home, I didn't turn on the lights right away. The stillness of my apartment felt like a mirror. The same quiet that had filled the cafe seemed to have followed me here. I set my keys down, took off my coat, and sat by the window, watching the last raindrops slide down the glass. Somewhere inside me, something small had shifted. It wasn't dramatic, just a slow, steady change, like a door creaking open after being stuck for years. I opened my notebook, not the cafe's one, but my own, the one I've been carrying for months without touching. The first few pages were full of lists, deadlines, reminders, things to fix, things to achieve, all urgency, no feeling. I flipped past them until I found a blank page. For a long moment, I just looked at it, the quiet emptiness of it, and realized how rare it was to face something that didn't demand anything from me. Then I started to write. Not for work, not for anyone to read, just for me. I wrote about the sound of rain against old glass, about the smell of cinnamon and roasted coffee, about the old man who poured truth into cups, and the strangers who reminded me that stillness was a kind of strength. As I wrote, I felt my breath slow. Each word came like an exhale, and in that quiet moment, I understood what the barista meant. The truth isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers, and sometimes it just waits for you to listen. I closed my notebook, set it aside, and sat back in my chair. The rain had stopped completely now. Outside, the city lights flickered against the wet pavement, and in this reflection of the window, I caught a glimpse of myself, a little tired but peaceful. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was chasing life. I felt like I was walking beside it. In the days that followed, life continued, as it always does. The buses still crowded the streets, phones still buzzed with messages, and the sky still turned from blue to gray to night again. Nothing outside had changed, but somehow everything inside me had. I woke up earlier now, without rushing. Instead of checking my notifications first, I opened the window and
let the morning air in. It was cool and quiet, carrying the faint smell of rain from the night before. For a few minutes each morning, I just stood there, breathing, doing nothing, expecting nothing. The first few days felt strange, like wearing a new rhythm that didn't quite fit yet. The world still moved fast, but I no longer felt the need to match its pace. I found myself walking slower, listening more, even noticing small things I used to miss. The way sunlight slipped through tree branches, or how people smiled to themselves when they thought no one was looking. At work, things were the same. Deadlines came, emails piled up, and people spoke in quick sentences that left no space for silence. But even in that noise, I felt a little bubble of calm around me. A small piece of that cafe that I had somehow carried home. Whenever stress started to rise in my chest, I remembered the sound of rain against glass, the soft jazz playing, and the barista's quiet voice saying, "How special, no sugar, just truth." That line stayed with me like a mantra, and sometimes in the middle of a meeting, or while stuck in traffic, I would whisper it to myself. Even it was enough to slow my heartbeat, enough to remind me that the world would still be there if I didn't rush towards it. On some evenings after work, I would walk without a destination, just wandering through streets, watching the city move like a film I didn't need to control. Some nights it rained again, and I smiled because the rain no longer felt cold. It felt like home. People around me began to notice too. "You seem calmer lately," a friend said one afternoon. "Did something happen?" I shook my head and smiled. "Not really. I just had coffee." They laughed, not understanding. But that was okay. Some things can't be explained. They can only be lived. And deep down, I knew the truth. The peace isn't found in silence alone, but in learning to carry it with you, even when the world is loud.
A few weeks passed before I found myself walking along that same old street again. It wasn't planned. My feet just led me there, as if they remembered a promise my mind had already forgotten. The rain had returned, gentle and familiar, painting the streets with rippling reflections. The city was quieter that evening, and the air smelled like it had before, fresh, heavy with the scent of wet concrete and peace. As I turned the final corner, there it was, the same little cafe at the end of the street. Its sign still swung softly above the door, faded letters whispering the same words: open, coffee, and peace. The warm light from inside spilled onto the pavement. Through the window, I could see the same tables, the same bookshelves, even the same little lamp glowing on the counter. But something felt different. Not wrong, just changed. When I stepped inside, the bell chimed softly. The air carried that same comforting smell of roasted coffee beans and cinnamon. The jazz music still played faintly in the background. Yet behind the counter, the old man was gone. In his place stood a young woman, maybe in her late 20s, with calm eyes and a small, knowing smile. She looked up as I entered, and for a moment it felt like she had been expecting me.
"Welcome back, traveler," she said warmly.
Her voice had that same softness, the same rhythm as his, as if the cafe itself had taught her how to speak. I looked around again. Everything was still familiar, but every detail seemed touched by a gentle new energy, the kind of change that doesn't erase the past, but grows quietly from it. I asked, "Is the barista here?" She shook her head lightly, wiping her hands on her apron. She said, "He doesn't work here anymore. He told me it was time for him to rest. Before he left, he said the cafe needed someone younger, someone who would keep it open for people who still needed a quiet place." I smiled softly. I said, "He was right, and it looks like he left it in good hands." The girl smiled again, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The silence felt comfortable, like a conversation that didn't need words. Then she asked, "Would you like your usual?" I blinked in surprise. "My usual?" She nodded, a hint of playfulness in her eyes. "House special, no sugar, just truth." I couldn't help but laugh. It was the same sentence, the same melody of words, but coming from a new voice. A reminder that some things end and some simply continue in a different form. "Truth, then," I said, and sat down by the same window where I had once watched the rain.
It was a week after my visit when the letter arrived. There was no return address, no stamp, just my name written neatly in faded blue ink. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Hardly anyone wrote letters anymore. But when I turned it over, I saw a small mark on the back, the outline of a tiny coffee cup drawn in the same hand-painted style as the cafe's old sign. I smiled without meaning to. The paper smelled faintly of cinnamon and coffee. It was as if the scent of that place had found its way to me again. I opened it carefully. Inside, on cream-colored paper, was a short handwritten note. "He wanted you to have this. He said you'd understand when you read it. Thank you for coming back." Below the words was another sheet, a folded letter written in the old barista's careful handwriting. The ink had bled slightly at the edges, as though time itself had softened it. I unfolded it and began to read. "If you're holding this, it means I've moved on. Not far, just to a quieter place, one where stories keep brewing even without me. I never owned the cafe, you know. It's the cafe that owns us, those of us who need to remember what stillness feels like. You once wrote in the notebook,
maybe slowing down isn't losing time. Maybe it's finding it again. When I read that, I knew the cafe had done its work for you. It found you when you needed it most. I've watched people come and go. Some leave lighter, some think pinking, some never come back. And that's fine. The cafe is a place for passing through, not for staying. If you ever feel lost again, don't look for the cafe. Look for the space it left inside you. You'll find the same peace there. I stopped reading. For a while, I just stared at the paper, the words blurring slightly as my eyes stung. It wasn't sadness, not exactly. It was gratitude, the kind that sits deep and still in your chest. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Outside my window, rain had begun to fall again, soft and familiar. Somewhere in the quiet rhythm of those drops, I could almost hear the bell above the cafe door ringing once more.
That night, I couldn't sleep. The words from the letter kept circling in my mind, softly, like the echo of rain on the window. Don't look for the cafe. Look for the space it left inside you. I sat up, turned on the small lamp beside my bed, and opened my notebook again, the same one I had written in weeks ago. The page with my handwriting, still waiting patiently like a held breath. Maybe peace had always been there, just hidden beneath the noise of living. We keep searching for quiet places, but sometimes the quiet isn't a place at all. It's a choice, a slow breath, a single moment when we decide to stop running. I thought about the people from the cafe, the sketching girl, the old woman reading her story, the man by the window, and the barista who brewed truth instead of coffee. Each of them had carried something heavy, yet somehow they left the cafe lighter. Maybe that's what it was built for. A place that teaches you how to leave your burdens behind without taking them from you. It doesn't heal you. It just gives you space to start breathing again. Outside, the city was asleep. Even the rain had softened into silence. I could hear my own heartbeat, slow and steady, matching the rhythm of my thoughts. I wrote in my notebook again, the pen gliding smoothly over the paper. Peace is not found in silence. It's carried in motion. It travels with us, in the space between one breath and the next. As the ink dried, I smiled. The barista had been right. Truth does wake you up, but not in a way that shocks or startles. It wakes you like sunlight through a window, slowly, gently, completely. I closed my notebook, and for a while, I just sat there, letting the quiet settle around me like a blanket. The world outside would start spinning again tomorrow. There would be meetings, deadlines, noise, but none of it scared me anymore. Because somewhere deep inside, I knew the cafe was still open. Not at the end of a street, but in the calm space I carried with me. The one that coffee and peace had built together. A few days later, I walked past the cafe again. The sign was still there, swinging gently in the evening wind. Open, coffee and peace. Through the window, I
I saw the young woman standing behind the counter, wiping a cup, humming softly to herself. For a moment, I almost walked in, but I didn't. Instead, I stood across the street, watching as a few strangers stepped through the door, each of them carrying the same expression I once wore, a quiet exhaustion, a search for something they couldn't name. And I smiled, because I knew they would find it there. I looked up at the fading sky. The first stars were peeking through the clouds, and somewhere far away, thunder rolled softly, not as a warning, but as a heartbeat of the world. I took one last breath of that warm, coffee-scented air, then turned to go. The rain began again, light as dust, each drop falling like a memory returning home. As I walked, I realized something simple. Peace isn't something we find once and keep forever. It's something we learn to return to again and again, each time the world becomes too loud. Every quiet breath, every small pause between moments is another doorway back to the cafe. And in that moment, I felt it again. The warmth of that small room, the sound of gentle jazz, the barista's calm voice saying, "House special, no sugar, just truth." The city lights blurred through the rain, and I thought about all the people I'd never meet who would one day find that place at the end of the street, and maybe, like me, carry a little piece of it with them when they left. When I finally reached the corner, I stopped, looked back one last time, and whispered quietly, "Thank you." Then I turned and kept walking. The rain fell, steady and kind. The world moved on, and so did I, but slower now, with peace in every step.